Thanks everyone. Thanks for B-Sides for having me. So 3D printer goes BRRRR, but I guess first about me, that's me talking at B-Sides Belfast, and then I crudely sort of threw that into Meshy and then printed myself off. I wish I only weighed 3 grams. And then there's little me over there. I work in Oracle. I'm sort of threat intelligence, but I do other things as well. Previously worked in Salesforce on the incident response team. You can find me on those socials there. The coin that I'm giving away, I've uploaded a design, so if you don't get one today, you can print that off yourself. Some recent work there as well. I'll share the slides afterwards, so we can link to all those. I guess let's get into the talk, right? So making has been here for years. Usually when people want to show the history of making, they show like the pyramids or like a wonder of the world. I went with a bit of a different approach, right? This is Monte Testaccio. I can't speak Italian. It's called the hill of pots, basically. Those are amphorae there. They were used to carry basically olive oil from Andalusia to Rome. That hill is 37 meters high, and it's effectively made of rancid olive oil pots that have stacked on top of each other over the years, right? So, humanity has been making things for like thousands of years, and we've always had issues, but we've had to do it for various purposes. And, now we get to 3D printing. So way back in 1958, in MIT, they start experimenting with effectively, computer numerical control code. So this was like maybe a year after like Fortran was released. You see effectively what's called G code or RS-274. Originally this was used to control plotters, so it was moved on an X and a Y axis. Various iterations kind of later, you'll see them kind of move to, 3, 4, 5 axis. It's interesting, later in the talk, we kind of talk about Core XY machines. We've actually kind of gone back to 2 axis. G code is effectively the code that, when you think of like complex design files, it gets compiled into G code, and that's what actually moves the printhead, basically. Flash forward to the 80s, actually in Japan, they first kind of came up with this idea of what's called stereolithography. It's like resin 3D printing, right? It's the concept behind that, how that works with lasers and resin. I'm not a scientist, so can't explain it to you really. But they actually came up with the idea in Japan. I think it was Dr. Kayamoda, but he couldn't make a machine, so he couldn't get the patent. And then Chuck Hull comes along in America. He gets a patent, I think, filed in 1985. He founds this company called 3D Systems, and then they actually release the stereolithography. And in so doing, he created the STL file, which is still around today. A few years later, then Scott and Lisa Crump, their husband and wife, they found a company called Stratasys, which is still around, and they patented and launched the first FDM printer, which is printing layer by layer, effectively. So a bunch of patents happened in the 80s, and then all the 3D printing throughout the 80s and 90s is mostly in sort of the private sector, right? Flash forward to kind of 2005, the University of Bath gets a big grant from the UK government, and they decide, well, are we going to buy, I think they bought a $30 million machine and a $50,000 machine, which was the cheapest at the time. And Adrian Boyer, was a professor there. He founds this project called the BRRRR project to make sort of scalable, easy to use, cost-effective 3D printers. And that picture is actually, they printed one printer with the other printer. It was kind of the first of its kind. 2008 then, patents start to expire, 3D files get passed around online, and a site called Thingiverse launches. And then we see, a bunch of things happen as patents start to expire. The reason this is up to 2014 is most of them have expired, I think, by 2009, and then 2014, a bunch of other key patents expire. Slicer launches. That's a sort of open source slicing software. We have open source firmware launching like Marlin and Clipper, and then a bunch of companies start to get founded out of that. There's effectively like Prusa Research, Markforged, Creality, all around the same era. We come into sort of the second phase then, right? With the patents expired, you just see this explosion of things happening throughout the 2010s. I think in 2013, President Obama effectively mentioned 3D printing in the State of the Union address, but many companies all over the world were setting up. In 2015, a bunch of them came together, created this new file as part of the 3MF consortium. So, you'll see today, like, a lot of printers will use like 3MF files that they'll compile that to G-code with slicer software, basically. 2018, an Ender 3 releases, and I have one, so I'll be showing you mine later in the talk. 2020, a bunch of people leave DJI, which is, drone company in China. They go on and they found Bamboo Lab. Bamboo Lab effectively creates this whole new era of sort of printers that are like, easier to use, not as complex, more sort of the common person can use them without having to just mess with a printer. Like, you see more slicers launch, more websites launch, and there's still a lot of innovation. The picture over there is actually from, I think 5-6 days ago, a YouTuber, Rotes 4.0. He prints speed benches. He printed one with like parts that he made himself, but some commodity parts in 74 seconds. Benchy, that was actually a design made in 2015. That was released open source. It's kind of like the standard for like testing your printer, because it tests effectively all the sort of like, hard to print mechanical elements, basically. So in terms of a security perspective, right, a 3D printer is a sort of an everything machine, right? It's like an IoT device. It's got cameras in it. It's an ICS system, and it's moving a print head, right? It's heating things up. It's connected to a cloud in some cases, and it's also like personal Linux computer. Like if you look at it on your network, your network monitoring software might even fingerprint it as effectively Linux. But what does that mean for us, right? So given the history, given that sort of convergence, we're effectively back to somewhere in the 90s or the 2000s. We skipped the 90s effectively in terms of 3D printing because of all the patents, right? So they all expire. We're reliving that today. 3D print files are getting passed around. There's moral panics, and we'll be talking about some of those in a minute. We're seeing increasing government control. We're seeing espionage at a whole bunch of different levels. There's massively globalized supply chain. And then, there's this eternal September problem where, like, back when, the internet sort of first launched, I think it used to be the case of like people would go to college and their first time using the internet, and then September would be a write-off month, effectively teaching people how to use the internet. But now it's like, when the internet launched, I think in 1993 or 4, it just effectively kind of like, every month was September, right? And we're kind of seeing that with 3D printers, in that like everything has to be appeal to effectively people who are not familiar. They haven't been tinkers for like, tinkering with printers for years. They've kind of like, been messing around with it. Like maybe like they watched a few YouTube videos. So you have to appeal to, everyone basically. So, let's do some threat modeling. So, originally I was kind of going to talk about like sort of the CIA triad. So, but it's a bit of a data centric model and really doesn't cut, in terms of like, 3D printing. So instead we have Maslow's hierarchy of 3D printing security, right? So my wife is a business teacher as well, so this was very handy. But so at the bottom we have physical safety. The second level we have government and regulatory risk. The third level we have vendor lock-in and enshittification. We'll be talking about that in a second. Then we have cybercrime and supply chain, and then at the top we have psychological vampirism. We'll explain what that is. But, people are either trying to stop you printing, or they want to watch you printing, or they want to take what you've printed for free. So, the threat model is sort of a bit different than just the classic sort of cyber use case. So physical safety, right? Your printer can have a thermal runaway in that it can catch on fire. That's called a bento box. It's a filter for a 3D printer. It's a clue that they sell filters. The fact that it's bad for you to breathe in, right? You could print guns. That's the FGC Mark II, which is a fuck gun control, right? So like, it's their name, not mine. You can get splinters. It has food, like food safety issues, right? If you use a 3D printed plate and you don't wash it properly, or it has like, it's porous and it has holes, you can get salmonella and, it won't end well. I have 5 kids, so, I've learned quite quickly that it's a choking hazard. It's also quite sharp. If it breaks, some of the, PLAs, like some of the plastics are quite brittle, basically. You can also print weapons with it, which, that's probably not good. So government and regulatory risk, there's a lot, right? Right now, a lot of like the sort of like printing weapons, printing knives, it's already banned, but then that really isn't your sort of issue, right? It's that like to enforce this, they have to monitor you. So in Washington state, they're introducing a House Bill 2321, and it has language like the database of disallowed firearms blueprint files that an algorithm uses must be able to be regularly updated to an extent that with a frequency to be determined by the Attorney General by rule. So, to do that, they have to actually peer inside your printer. And there's I took this from another YouTuber recently where they posted a video about this Spanish company called Print and Go, where they're actually making the software to actually look in your printer, and they're going to use AI effectively to watch what you're printing so that like, even if you're trying to confuse the system, they can still get you. There's some really good articles out there talking about like why this doesn't work and why, like real criminals are actually just going to get away with it. But you can see even in Ireland, like people are, there's already this moral panic growing, right? There's 2 articles there where like the Gardaí are, seizing 3D printed guns, basically ghost guns. So then we get to vendor lock-in, right? So if you've got away from the government, you've avoided physical safety issues. Well, now you just have to worry about the vendor just deciding you can't use your printer because computer says no. There was a big controversy last year when Bamboo Lab, a big sort of 3D printer manufacturer, released this firmware update introducing authorization control. And, the text highlighted in blue says, due to the importance of these updates, your product may block new print jobs before the update is installed. So the fact that they can do that means that like they have you at your their mercy basically. Over there is Centuri Carbon by Elegoo. They basically said they were going to support multi-material, sort of this like AMS like advanced multi-material system that Bamboo Lab have, equivalent to that basically. And then they just decided no. So they sold it, get everyone's hopes up, and then, effectively it didn't pan out that way. But then, you look around the world and you think, are we in a trade war? As we heard in our keynote this morning, they could just shut off the cloud systems and suddenly it doesn't work anymore. So I've kind of paraphrased the WEF here in the sense of you'll own something, but you'll be unhappy, right? Is it really your device? And then we get to cybercrime, which is, probably what most of us love. You're passing files around, right? It's very LimeWire-y in the sense of where are these files coming from? Who is making the files? What could the files do? People have found vulnerabilities, and there's actually that was sort of hacking for good there, where effectively they compromised machines ahead of time to sort of warn owners about the flaws. Your cloud accounts can get account takeover, right? People can get your password and they can just log in and take your personal information. There's even more kind of extreme cases where effectively they're doing VANEC phreaking on devices there, which I thought was really cool, but sort of preposterous at the same time. And then, we get to psychological vampirism. So, psychological vampirism, in my sense, I think people should be credited with the work they do, right? I've tried to credit as many people who have done work that, I've used for this talk. Not everyone thinks the same way, and they will effectively feed off your ideas, right? And we're seeing Prusa, who, historically being a big kind of supporter of open source, they've actually had to create basically a new license because they release all their designs open source, but then other people were coming along and selling their designs and competing against them. Maker World, which is Bamboo Labs' site, they're doing copyright protection now. And even when I was uploading the file, they were asking did you want to block this on other sites? And they'll go out and do that for you. So, they're also fighting back against AI slop because you see a lot of people taking designs and then selling them on their different names on other sites. So, meet my printers. I said I had 5 kids. These are my other kids. So my first printer was an Ender 3, and I still have it. This is the sort of probably the most popular printer in the whole world, I would say, in terms of units sold. I put it in sort of a grow tent there to make sure that it doesn't catch on fire. It doesn't have network connectivity out of the box. It's massively upgradable, right? You can change like everything you want about this. You'll even see like down the bottom left, I have a filament runout sensor that I haven't even attached, right? So I'm still updating this like years and years after it's been released. I have a Raspberry Pi there with just a simple webcam. That's running Octoprint. So effectively that allows me to do network, network control, monitoring, stuff like that. My other printer is a bit fancier. I bought this in July. They actually discontinued it just in November. Cloud services and all that still works. I'm very happy with it, honestly. It just works. It's like the iPhone of printers, right? If you want a coin, like they were all made with this, right? Like they're I can't say really much bad things about it. The only thing is you're really tied into sort of Bamboo's ecosystem unless you want to go into sort of dev mode, which, it also has a problem with poops in that it's quite wasteful. You see like the little waste basket next to it, right? Every time it's changing filament, it like kind of puts some stuff out the back. And then here's my workshop computer. This isn't really anything to do with 3D printing, but I just wanted to show you I had one, and so I keep things segmented. It just sits there. I actually 3D printed a little box there as well, but it's extremely humid there. Like usually reaches like 94% humidity. So, I kind of leave it on because I in hopes that would burn away the water. And then this is my other passion, which I could probably do a separate talk on, but this is my network cupboard, carefully redacted. I've changed this around and I actually hope to change it around a lot more in the future, but, I run sort of like, I have these shark taps, few of them, and collecting sort of like, packets and piping it into a security onion, which is basically running Zeek. And, I also have a Pi hole, and then some of the other panels, like in sort of the stuff to hold the wires back. So I'm using multi-board. They're the panels. It's a 3D printed project. Check it out. And then Underwear 2.0, which is the sort of cable routing. I think the maker there is Hands-On Katie. So yeah, both those projects well worth a look. So I monitored the printers for about a month, maybe 2 months. I had to leave them on. And honestly, I did a lot of analysis. I cut up the data in a bunch of different ways, and this guy did it already back in 2023, and he wrote it up way better than I ever could. And, this whole talk could have turned into, I found something mad that the Bamboo Lab was sending back to China. I didn't really find anything like that. It's printing. It seems fine. A lot of the services you'll see like regionally, they're actually not, it's not going back. They're fronted in sort of a different region, probably just to be closer to you, right? So you're just seeing things like Cloudflare really. So what's happening behind the scenes? Hard to tell. I suggest you read that guy's article though. So it's really, really detailed. Bamboo Lab ecosystem, because of a bunch of different concerns, they actually created a trust center, and they actually published like a breakdown of like what they see their security model as, and they kind of cross like device security, software security, cloud security, bunch of like really interesting articles. Their wiki is actually really good. It helps you take everything apart, but also explains like what's going on under the hood. And then I did the same for my Octoprint, my Octopi. That was kind of interesting. A bit more things happening because it's effectively like a Raspberry Pi. So, but again, no smoking gun, unfortunately. So Octo printing with care then, right? Because the Octopi is a bit more like left up to you. I looked into that in detail. Project's been around for I think nearly over 15 years, right? So there's a lot of stuff that's been written. They actually released a guide back in 2018 on sort of safe remote access, but they actually have a big plugin store with third-party extensions effectively into Telegram and other things where you can control it remotely. They use GitHub to publish security advisories, and you have to update quite regularly. But generally, as long as you don't, expose it to the internet and the full force of the internet, it's fine. You can get detailed logging. You can do granular permissions. All those things are going to come in interesting in a few seconds because, wait, is that all? you said the 3D printer would go BRRRR. Also, it's February 2026, and we all know what that means. OctoClaw, make me benchies. So I looked on the clawhub.ai, and they had a Bamboo Lab skill for OpenClaw, I guess it's called now. I didn't really fancy giving my nice fancy machine access to my Bamboo Lab account, so we went with Octoprint, and there was no skills. So I was like, okay, opportunity. So I literally could make a skill within like 20 minutes. Like I spent longer probably setting up OpenClaw than I did actually building a skill. It just wrote itself. And then like you could use natural language to like, give me the stats, show me a screenshot. And that's those screenshots are actually from Telegram. So, it was bizarrely effective. I really enjoyed it. But then I unleashed it upon the world. So I put it up on GitHub, so you can actually see it on my GitHub, if you want to have a look. I also put it up on ClawHub, and it immediately got flagged, as suspicious. So I was like, that's not good. But then I looked, and VirusTotal just told me it was extremely dangerous. So that was fine. However, mistakes were made. When I uploaded it the first time, I got the really nice slug OctoClaw, and I was like, yeah. And then I realized, oh no, my Octoprint API key is in the files. And now I got OpenClaw to upload its own skill. So technically, I didn't make the mistake, but it was. So then I was like, "Oh, overwrite, fix it," and of course, it's like you can see the versions. So then I was just like, "Oh no, it's fine. You can rotate the thing fairly easily." But I was like, "Delete. We'll start again. We'll go with OctoClaw-print." So if you're ever wondering, that's a bit of lore there. But then, we come back to this. So I laughed at the CIA triad earlier, and then it came back to bite me because confidentiality obviously matters, right? So, have you ever seen a meme of a security concept model? I had to make that one myself. So, there's hope, kinda. I would say AI design is better than ever. Even if it does do you dirty, there's still lots of players in the market, right? So there's lots of choice out there. It's also like some of the players like Prusa, for example, they really go into like sort of supporting open source. So like it's actually better than normal printers. You can just throw random globs of plastic at it and it actually print you out really nice stuff. I wish I could afford a Prusa though. So then I was thinking like, well, what about defensible home networks? And, generally the models are like, just plug it out, do like a local only mode. That kind of robs you of a lot of functionality. You could do like an isolated VLAN. So that's kind of like the setup I have for the most part. That's why I have the separate workshop machine. You could go with a Bastion host where you actually have it on the VLAN, but like all your traffic is routed through a Bastion. And then you could go with something like much more complicated, but still feasible for like a home user, which would be like a zero trust using Tailscale or something like that. So, then, because I work in detection and response every day, so my brain is like, how can I work this as an incident? Well, like, I'm already monitoring it with Security Onion, but, Pi-hole, I have that as well. I could set up OS query on the Raspberry Pi if I wanted to. You could write your own Yara rules. I was thinking of even like, you could actually build like a malware scanner just for the 3D printed files, but, it's trying to find good use cases there, really. You could use something like Wazoo or Waza. I can never really pronounce that one, but it's like an open source, like endpoint detection tool. You could have your own SIEM if you wanted to as well, which is kind of comes a package with Security Onion, really, if it has Elasticsearch. And then it's just really about playbooks. And some of the playbooks and sort of the ways to respond, like I was thinking about this and, I was like, what would my family do if I wasn't there? And like this just randomly caught on fire or like, how can I get like out of band alerting? So like being prepared to respond and knowing like how you will respond to certain situations so you don't just have to make it up on the day. It's always good to know. Also, if you do have an issue, just always physically inspect it afterwards because, there could be some bit of plastic lodged in the machine or the firmware could be corrupted or something bad like that. So think beyond the sort of the hobbyist bubble, right? So everything I've shown you is sort of like home lab hobbyist-ish. But like, there's, this is a business, right? And like, the reason it was like, effectively, there was a lot of patents and you didn't see sort of, RepRap kind of relaunched it for like, for the hobbyist folk effectively is because like, there's a lot of money here, right? So, parametric design is an interesting thing where like there's designs where like you can plug in sort of like, the measurements effectively and it'll generate the design. But like, that's effectively a large attack surface for a vendor like Bamboo Lab, right? Because you could just put anything in there and you could effectively exploit their machine that's doing the rendering. There's also software like AstroPrint and a bunch of other print farm management software to actually manage like a fleet of different 3D printers. There's an American company called Slant 3D. They have a lot of actually content on YouTube, but they have a service called Teleport where you can have like a storefront for your 3D printed object. And if you're buying in Europe, it actually makes it in Europe and ships to you. If you're buying in the US, it does the same in the US. And that bypasses tariffs basically. So that kind of exposes them to maybe a different regulatory risk profile than you would otherwise see. And then obviously there's complex design software, which can always be attacked because there's a million ways into it. So I reached out to a real professional. I actually knew him from, I'm originally from Limerick, and I think he's a Limerick man as well, but he's now in Galway. So Galway has great 3D printing companies. He, I think, is the owner of two of them, MedScan and 3D Technology Limited. And I asked him, like, hey, doing this security talk, like, what's your thoughts? And he was like, customers are really concerned. His name is James Wall, by the way, real nice guy, and I suggest you check out the companies. But he was saying, like, customers are concerned about data sovereignty. They don't know, kind of if it's an issue, if it's not an issue, like, how can we assure them effectively? And then he also mentioned a lot of vendors are pushing ISO 27001 as sort of to proof of their pedigree. And that's it. So there's some 3D printed memes as well. I like the bottom one because this whole talk was revealed to me by the microplastics in my brain. So, thank you.